And I'm also now excited to introduce our panelists for tonight. The topic is Forest, Logging, Climate, and Fire in Idaho's Clearwater Country. And so first we'll have Advocates for the West Executive Director Laird Lucas, and he will be sharing a little history of our work with the Clearwater and why we care about it. Next, we're very lucky to have Katie Billadou from Friends of the Clearwater with us tonight. She's going to provide some background on her organization's work, as well as a breakdown of logging, fires, and forest health in the Clearwater. And then finally, Brian Hurlbut, staff attorney with Advocates for the West, and Rebecca Strauss, legal fellow with Advocates for the West, are going to provide some information on the latest case that we just filed today that relates to this very discussion. And then, like I said, we'll save some time at that end for questions. So just chat them during the presentation if you'd like, but know that we probably won't get them to them till the end. And so with that, I will hand over the mic to Laird.
Hi, everybody. Now, am I going to pop up on the screen here, Madeline? I don't see myself. I see you still.
Yep, you'll be popping up.
Okay. Can you go back to the panelists for a second?
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, I don't see myself on here, and so that's fine. It's always weird to sort of talk and not even see who you're talking to. But if we can go to the next slide, Madeline, I'm really thrilled to be talking with you guys, to talk with all of us about the Clearwater Country. You know, I came to Idaho in 1993 to be a public interest environmental lawyer, and very early on started working on Clearwater issues. At the time, the Clearwater and the Nez Perce National Forest had just adopted their first forest plans in the late 80s, and there was litigation over them, and I was involved in that and some settlements, and we started litigating some logging cases. Had a lot of cases over the Clearwater Basin, and of course it just rings true to me to be protecting the Clearwater. Some of the imagery you'll see, obviously, yes, it evokes what a stunning country this is. And I came here from a background of whitewater kayaking, where hitting the rivers of Idaho, these wild and scenic rivers, the Lochsaw, the Selway, the Clearwater, all of those are so great. And so just going to flash a couple images here to kind of give tribute to what we're talking about. But to look at the map here, you know, this is North Central Idaho, and this map gives you a good sense of where it lies in the west, but you really need to drill down more. And I'm afraid I don't have the best maps, but if you go to the next one, this one is hard to see, but the reason I'm putting it on here is to give a sense of the geography. And Madeline's going to circle around the Nez Perce Tribal Reservation. We have to start with acknowledging that this is Nez Perce country. This is where Lewis and Clark came down and were saved by the Nez Perce tribe when they were starving. And it's the Nez Perce tribe's ancestral homelands, and they still have treaty protected rights here. So everything we do in fighting for the Clearwater and the Nez Perce, what are called the national forest now, needs to be remembered that it traces back to the Nez Perce tribe, and we are newcomers, and we want to give respect and acknowledge what has happened over the last couple hundred years to the Nez Perce tribe, to the native people, how land has been taken from them, but it is still national forest land that is subject to federal laws and protections in an area worth fighting for. And the dark green on this map here, of course, are the wilderness areas. Selway Bitterroot, Frank Church, and then Gospel Hump, slightly to the west of the Frank Church there. And then to the north and the west of all those wilderness areas are the wonderful lands of the Clearwater National Forest and the Nez Perce National Forest, with, you know, when I was fighting for these beginning in the 90s, with millions of acres of roadless that were not protected as wilderness, that were open to logging and to roads, and had been the timber breadbasket of Idaho since the 50s. And when I started working on this in the late 80s or early 90s, there were still veterans from the wars of trying to protect these areas against all the industrial logging and roads that had gone in before. People like Al Espinosa, a fisheries biologist with the Clearwater National Forest, who I worked with, and who still is is on the board today of the Friends of the Clearwater, who are our guests today. And we work with so many groups. If you go to the next map, please. This helps kind of show the area a little bit better. The Nez Perce National Forest and the Clearwater National Forest were separated. They've been joined together for management purposes for a couple of decades now. They have separate forest plans. They're very similar. The landscape they protect is an integrated one. If you'll kind of start at the north with the North Fork of the Clearwater there, Madeline, the North Fork of the Clearwater River with its many tributaries, and then of course the Lochsaw River draining the Bitterroots down to its confluence with the Selway River also draining the Bitterroots, the two wild and scenic rivers forming the middle fork of the Clearwater, and then on down to the main Clearwater. And to the south is the South Fork of the Clearwater. That little square is an inholding in the middle of it where Elk City is. And then to the south, of course, is the Salmon River, the mighty Salmon River, which turns and flows north. And the area between the South Fork of the Clearwater and the Salmon is one of the areas we're going to be talking about today. If we can go to the next map. If you go to the next map, please. Why do we care about this area? When I first came in the 90s, like I say, roadless areas were one of the big deals. Stop them from putting in roads into the wild areas. And there were millions of acres. These are just quick maps to give you a sense of the inventoried roadless areas. Of course, the Clinton administration adopted a roadless rule at the end of their period, 1999 or so, which has provided a lot more protection to Idaho roadless areas, but not complete. And there's still a lot of what do qualify as roadless areas, wild areas that aren't protected under the roadless rule or the Idaho roadless rule that still have important values. And what does roadless mean? Let's go to the next slide. Roadless means it's a landscape for a lot of important fish and wildlife, grizzly bear just being one of them. Again, these maps are a little hard to see, but the pink in the center is the Bitterroot recovery zone. And that's the area we're talking about here that encompasses the Bitterroots, the Selway Bitterroots, the Frank Church. And go to the next map. This is a map prepared by Amy Hawk, who's a geographer and an ecologist on our board, recently looking at the security of habitat for a variety of wide-ranging species, including grizzly bear. And again, here in this map, you can see right in the center of the Bitterroot and all the lands around it. We know grizzly bear need to connect from the greater Yellowstone ecosystem to the east. They need to connect up to the northern Rockies, the Cabinet Yaak and the Selkirks to the north. And so protecting these large areas for grizzly bear is one of the important things we care about. If you'll go to the next slide, and there's others too, like the Fisher. This is another map by Amy Hawk. Fishers have a West Coast population, but a Northern Rockies population. And again, they need old growth habitat. They need intact habitats in order to survive. And we've been mapping exactly what are the states of those habitats and where do they need to be protected. If you go to the next slide. And of course, for salmon and steelhead, the Idaho salmon and steelhead, the Clearwater River and the Salmon River, they're two key basins that remain available to them largely for recovery if we can get rid of the lower Snake River dams. And so now over the years that I've been working on the Clearwater, I've done a lot of work over many of these drainages, the North Fork Clearwater and the Lochsaw. If you'll keep going through these slides a little bit. There's some beautiful, beautiful places here. Keep going with the photos. These are just examples. These photos are thanks to Katie and Friends of the Clearwater that I'm flashing up. And as we got into the middle 1990s, one of the things that happened is this whole area of the Idaho batholith has highly granitic soils. They fall apart, are highly erosive, and all the logging and road building in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s left a legacy of old crappy forest roads and roads cut across mid slopes and down into streams, all kinds of sediment impacts. And in the winter of 95, 96, there was a series of storms that led to a series of landslides, a couple of different big landslide events, literally hundreds of landslides, mass wasting events on the Clearwater National Forest itself. And yet they wanted to keep logging, and punching in more roads. If you'll go to the next slide. We brought a big case beginning in the mid-90s. It finally was decided in 2000, and I can't go through all the words here, but we represented, stay on that one, Friends of the Clearwater, as well as Idaho Conservation League, Idaho Rivers United, the Wilderness Society, and several others. The Forest Service was planning multiple large timber sales totaling well over 100 million board feet in a bunch of roadless areas, one including Colt-Killed Creek, otherwise known as White Sands Creek, in the North Fork, in the Lochsaw, in those areas. And we fought them and fought them and fought them through a variety of advocacy, brought litigation in the District of Montana. And in the end, the Forest Service, and our focuses were on how logging and roads create sediment risks and landside risks that harm fisheries in the streams, and how they also are removing old growth habitat that are important for the grizzly bear, the fish, or what have you. So old growth and impacts from sediment and erosion to streams and fish have been our two major themes throughout my career of fighting for the Clearwater. And in this particular case, we ended up challenging the fish bait sale on the North Fork of the Clearwater. And we had a great ruling from the court, both on our old growth and on our landslide/sediment claims. And that and other pressures set back the Forest Service. Their logging program was cut back from 100 to 150 million board feet a year in the Clearwater alone to 20 million board feet a year. If you can go to the next slide, but they kept after it. Lori Rule and I, our staff attorney in Oregon now, brought another case in 2005. This was on behalf of Idaho Conservation League over a BLM logging sale on the South Fork of the Clearwater River. It wasn't that big, 10 million board feet, but it was there to improve. They claimed it would improve forest health. There's risks of wildfire. There's risks of bug disease. We have to improve forest health by logging it. We had a week-long trial, and we had Doc Partridge from the University of Idaho, a forestry expert, testifying, and we had fisheries and sediment experts testifying, and our experts were more persuasive to the court than the Forest Service, than BLM at that time, and the court agreed with us and stopped that timber sale. You go to the next slide. Those are just a couple of the things that we've done to protect the forests of the Nez Perce Clearwater. And then through that work and the love of the Clearwater, beginning in 2010, the threats of the big oil megaloads coming up the wild and scenic Lochsaw corridor, the Middle Fork and the Lochsaw up over the Bitterroot to the Alberta tar sands. If you can keep going through these slides, these are examples of the fights we were fighting. And of course, they went through the Nez Perce Tribe Reservation. The tribe, as well as local people, got very upset about this. Protests out in the streets, and yeah, keep going. And this is a little legacy of how we and Lynn Lahey and Borg Hendrickson were two of the ones. No, go back to that last one. We had case after case after case, all kinds of guerrilla fighting in state court and then in federal court. First representing local citizens, Lahey et al., then Idaho Rivers United, and then the Nez Perce tribe joined in. And then we got a federal court order in 2013 shutting down the Lochsaw River to the big oil megaloads. And then a settlement in January 2017 that pretty much shuts the highway down to these megaloads going forward. If you can go to the next slide, please. And that's not all of our battles. So those are all fighting for, we've gone back, the fighting for the wild and scenic country, the Lochsaw, the Selway, the Clearwater, and then there's more logging coming up. If you'll go to the next slide, we had two more lawsuits in 2015, 2016 after the Johnson Bar wildfire. These are photos from the state of Idaho's logging and private land logging in the wild and scenic corridor of the Selway River after the fire. After the fire, they log it in order to prevent more fire or hazards. It's just an excuse to get out there and logging and trash the land. If you go to the next picture, more examples of what the state did following the fire. And so we went to court on a Forest Service sale, 34 million board feet Johnson Bar sale for Idaho Rivers United. And again, we won rulings from the court there that the Forest Service hadn't looked at sediment and other impacts. But in this case, there was also the specific impacts on the wild and scenic river. And we used the photos like I just showed you of what it would look like if the Forest Service was allowed to keep a much larger project going forward on the Selway River after that. And so that's 2016. And bring it even more up to date, looking at the South Fork of the Clearwater River. Next slide. We have a case going on now. Brian Hurlbut is actually handling it with my help over suction dredge mining on the South Fork of the Clearwater. Lots of miners coming out claiming the right to suction dredge without having to get federal Clean Water Act permits. Well, we've dragged them to court and we're holding them accountable, working with ICL, Idaho Conservation League. They've had inspectors and other people out there for several years trying to protect salmon and steelhead in the South Fork of the Clearwater from the impacts of suction dredge. And if you'll go to the next slide, and this is what's bringing us now to up, there's a nice picture of the Gospel Hump, keep going. We're now going to be talking about the Salmon Clearwater Divide. Two massive logging sales that we just filed a complaint over today, End of the World and Hungry Ridge. And if you go to the next slide, these are some photos again from Friends of the Clearwater of what it looks like. This is the area we're protecting. Again, the Forest Service is saying they got to log the forest to save it. It's going to burn or die from bugs if we don't log it. And again, our key issues are the ones I've been fighting over for 30 years now. How is this going to affect sediment in the fish? How is it going to affect old growth habitat? How is it going to affect species like grizzly bear or fisher? So I'm going to turn it over there. I know I went a minute or two long. Sorry, fellow panelists. I think, Katie, we're to you now.
Thanks, Laird. And I just want to say thank you to Advocates for the West for having us and taking this case for us. My name is Katie Bilodeau. I'm a staff attorney with Friends of the Clearwater. And I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about my organization. I'm going to talk about the myths of fire, forest, and logging. I'll talk about some of the other impacts of logging and the logging amounts that we've seen in wild Clearwater country this decade. So, Friends of Clearwater was founded in 1987 by a former smoke jumper. We became a 501c3 in the 1990s. And today we're a small grassroots nonprofit that watchdogs some of the wildest lands remaining in the lower 48. We're a staff of 4. 3 of us do policy work, and we bring a policy experience of 70 plus years to what we do. And that's a testament more to my coworkers, Gary McFarland and Jeff Jewell, who make up a lion's share of those years. We follow timber sales in the Clearwater country that are proposed. We comment on those sales using the best available science, and we'll litigate when necessary. We also use Freedom of Information Act requests to acquire information on how the Forest Service is managing our national forests, and we go out to monitor conditions on the ground. Finally, we tackle policy issues with research and reports. A couple of years ago, we came out with a roadless report about how well the Idaho National Roadless Rule are protecting our lands. And we're currently in the midst of preparing an old growth report. So if you're interested at all in what we do, I really encourage you to visit our website, friendsoftheclearwater.org. And if you have any questions about some of the things I say today, or you want to see the science, I encourage you to reach out to us because we'd be more than happy to have that dialogue. So next slide. All right, so myth number 1, high severity wildfire is unnatural and bad in wild Clearwater country. High severity wildfire is actually not unnatural in the Northern Rockies. The Central to Northern Rockies have been formed by high severity wildfire regime for millennia. These are fires that cause maybe about 75% tree mortality and happen on the order of centuries. There are unique specialist species that exist and have adapted to this very specific post-high severity fire conditions, which also imply that high severity fire has been around with us for a long time. For example, you'll see on the right, the black-backed woodpecker. It has a black back. It kind of blends in with recently burned forests, and that's its niche. Like you'll often find black-backed woodpeckers in high severe, like post-fire conditions. So on the left, you'll see the morel mushrooms. There is also a high correlation between where morel mushrooms grow and places that have had high severity fire. So high severity fire also isn't bad. These fires don't consume trees to the point they're ashes. What they do is they create snags, and the snags comprise what are called snag forests, which are actually biodiversity hotspots. They contain more species diversity than other places. So next slide. Myth number 2, we can protect our homes by logging to reduce high severity fires miles away from communities on public lands. Logging miles away on public lands actually doesn't protect homes. Climate and wildfire are the primary drivers of fires, and fuels are secondary. Logging actually has a counterintuitive impact, which I'll address in a few slides. But protecting property ultimately means reducing the ignitability of a house and the features within 130 feet of that house. The picture you see here is a slide from Paradise, California, which I'm sure a lot of us remember as a tragic fire that happened a couple years back. What I found striking about this particular picture is that the trees, while they're burnt, are still there and the houses are gone. So in 2000, the Forest Service research scientist named Jack Cohen performed a series of experiments with ignitable materials and crown fires, and he found that the measures taken to reduce ignitability within the first 130 feet of the house have the most influence on whether a home is lost in a wildfire. Home ignitions ultimately depend on whether a structure is built with fire-resistant materials and whether there are flammable items on the ground near the structure. So Dr. Cohen found that homes with low ignitability can survive high intensity wildfire, and highly ignitable homes can actually be destroyed with lower intensity wildfire. And the fire loss problem is ultimately a problem of home ignitability and largely independent of wildland fuel management. So next slide, please. The only good tree is a live one. Dead trees bring a lot to ecosystems. Dead trees create the legacies and the heterogeneous structures, meaning they're not all the same height and they're not all the same age, which is a path to forming what we call old growth forests. They bring the bugs that eat the trees, the bugs bring the birds that eat the bugs. Dead trees can also provide structures that are easier to excavate in terms of nests, like pileated woodpeckers. Standing dead trees, which we call snags, dying trees, and trees that have died and fallen to the forest floor are used as denning habitat by mammals like fish or lynx. So on the right, you see there's a picture of Meadow Creek. If you look closely, it has a lot of dead trees in the forest. And the idea that forests have to have all living trees or that pictures of forests with dead trees are ugly are not an accurate reflection of an ecosystem at work. So my response to this idea that we need to calibrate is we need to calibrate what we think is a beautiful forest. To me, a beautiful forest is where nature is at work uninhibited by man. Next slide, please. All right, now that we know to appreciate the upper left-hand corner picture for its full beauty with dead trees and all, the thin the threat myth is everywhere. It's this idea the Forest Service has put out there for decades that logging somehow protects landscapes, and it's a really powerful myth. But logging has this direct and counterintuitive effect on wildfire intensity. Recent science is finding that while the primary driver of high severity wildfires is climate, managed landscapes, and by managed I mean logged, they create a secondary driver that can actually increase fire intensity. They open up space for wind, they open up canopies for sunlight to further dry out conditions on the forest floor. They create a homogeneous structure like the one you see in the picture on the upper right, which this is about 20 years after a place has been clear cut. So it means ladder fuels on top of each other with 20-foot high trees. On the other hand, in old growth, scientists are finding that fire can burn less severely, and that's because the canopy is closed on top. It breaks up the wind. The forest floor is moister. So logging also has direct costs. It creates openings that fragment in wildlife habitat. It's often accompanied by roads built to access logging units. It compacts soils, which makes it harder for vegetation to regrow when soil is for vegetation to regrow. And it changes the land for generations. You don't have to be a math major to know that when you clear an area of 150-year-old trees, you're not going to get 150-year-old trees back in that area again for 150 years. So next slide, please. Above on the left, you'll see the graphic, the NASA graphic on 2019 temperatures compared to historical averages. Forests are our carbon sinks. They remove or sequester carbon from the atmosphere in a process we call sequestration. They also store carbon. Trees that die in the forest still store carbon and release it slowly as they decay. So you'll hear some arguments that carbon is going to be stored in a tree or in a building material. So, why not have it stored in a house? Well, there are costs to removing the trees from the forest, and that's what the figure on the right-hand side is meant to show. We end up, when we cut trees, we don't take the entire tree. We strip the branches down and loggers burn those branches. And then we put trees on trucks and we burn fossil fuels to get trees to mills where we further process them. So by the time a tree's been cut, milled, delivered to its final destination, the net carbon stored is actually a fraction of what a live or dead tree would have been storing in the forest and decomposing for us on a time delay. The bigger the tree, the more carbon it sequesters. So by cutting it, you're not only releasing that carbon, but you've reduced the net ability for the forest to sequester it. So various accounting shows that the biggest source of carbon emissions on our national forests come from logging. And these carbon emissions from logging actually greatly exceed the carbon emissions from natural wildfire. Next slide, please. Other impacts of logging is you eliminate habitat. I think I talked about this a little earlier. You eliminate habitat for wildlife. Thinning, and the picture you're looking at on the left, I have to say, is not thinning. That's a clear-cut area. But thinning will even eliminate features like old growth. Old growth includes the dead trees on the ground. So when you're thinning these areas, you're actually eliminating the dying trees that species like pileated woodpeckers and fish are in need for nesting and denning. Logging can also impact mammal populations because building roads and clearing lands impact how animals move and where they select their home ranges. Next slide, please. So roads are often built to access logging units, or they're reconditioned so logging trucks can haul away timber, and roads produce sediment. They can produce sediment by dust, which is what I meant to show you in the picture on the left, and they can produce sediment by runoff. Next slide, please. Why is sediment in streams bad? Well, in addition to increasing temperatures, it can actually impair fish habitat by creating something called cobble embeddedness. And cobble embeddedness is where fine sediment kind of bury the rocks or the cobble. And this is important because steelhead lay their eggs in gravelly, rocky places. And when steelhead are tiny fry, they hide in these spaces to avoid predators. And so when there's fine sediment, excuse me, filling the spaces, it actually seals eggs into a tomb. And for steelhead fry, they'll just eliminate these safe hiding spots. And as you can see, there's a relationship between, with the chart on the right, with the quality of fish habitat and cobble embeddedness. And the more the cobble is buried in fine sediment, the poorer the habitat for the fish. Next slide, please. Okay, so we know logging means building roads, and roads create sediment. We know sediment runs into streams. And what I hope to show you with this map is an aggregate of the issue. So this map, if you can see the kind of squared off, slightly darker green, that is the Nez Perce National Forest. And inside inside these boundaries are a lot of red squiggly lines and green squiggly lines. And those are all of the forest roads that the Forest Service mapped in 2000. This map actually came from 2000. We had submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for it. And I show it to you because the red is where the Forest Service had mapped roads that they said were potentially in excess and didn't need to be on the forest. And so this is the last time the agency made a map like this. So what is important? Well, we occasionally see the Forest Service commit to decommissioning roads. Decommissioning roads are generally rolled into logging projects, and those logging projects often build or recondition just as many, if not more, roads than it actually decommissions. So with that, I'd like to talk about the logging projects we've seen on the increase since 2000. Next slide, please. Logging in wild Clearwater country has increased to the most that we've seen in the 21st century. When timber is cut to be sold, it's accounted for in measurements called board feet, and that is a volume of wood that is 1 foot long by 1 foot wide by 1 inch thick. And logging trucks you see on the road can haul about 3,000 to 6,000 board feet, to give you a bit of a visual. Next slide, please. Can you back up a couple? Yeah, that's great. So Notice the units on the y-axis. The y-axis are in 1,000 board feet. So an 80,000 on the chart is actually 80,000 board feet, which is 1,000,000 board feet. In the past 5 to 6 years, the Forest Service has sold more timber on the Nez Perce and Clearwater National Forest than any other year since 2000. And in 2020, they sold 84 million board feet off of these forests. That is equivalent to about 14 to 28,000 truckloads hauling off what they sold just in 2020. So think about that in terms of carbon emissions, the carbon sequestration eliminated, and the carbon released into the atmosphere. Next slide, please. Before I turn this over to Brian, I want to leave you thinking about what's in a name, because one of those logging projects Brian's going to discuss, the Forest Service is titled a restoration project. Next slide, please. So just as a rose by any other name would smell sweet, logging by any other name still degrades. The Forest Service doesn't call things timber sales anymore. So you have to look behind the title of the project to what the project proposes to do. So it doesn't matter if the Forest Service calls number 1 the Cove Mallard Timber Sale, or number 2 the Little Slate Project, number 3 the Lowell Wildland Urban Interface Project, or number 4 the Iron Mountain Vegetation Management Project. They're functionally equivalent. They're logging projects that have built roads, they've taken large trees, they've destroyed wildlife habitat, and they've contributed to carbon emissions. So thank you for your attention. And with that, I am turning it over to Brian.
That's great. It starts with an earthquake.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Brian Hurlbut, a staff attorney at Advocates for the West. And I'm going to talk to you about the new case we filed today, challenging 2 large logging projects called End of the World and Hungry Ridge. I'm going to be introducing the area where these are and the cases, and then my coworker Rebecca Strauss is going to talk in more detail about the actual case. So yeah, the two projects are called End of the World and Hungry Ridge. And we had a little audio there that only played for a second, but if anyone is familiar with it, you might have realized that was the song End of the World as We Know It by REM. We can move on to the next slide now. We'll skip that part, but might come back later. So the Salmon Clearwater Divide. Some of you might be thinking to yourselves, I'm not entirely sure where that is. Or some of you might even be thinking, you know, I've never heard of the Salmon Clearwater Divide. And if you're one of those people asking one of those questions and wondering that, there's a good reason for that. We just made it up about a couple months ago. We started working on this with Friends of the Clearwater, who had been participating for years in the administrative processes that led to the Forest Service approving these 2 logging projects. We were talking about them a lot, building the cases and asking, man, what is this area called when we talk about it? And there wasn't really a name for it. So we came up with the Salmon Clearwater Divide. In a second, I'll show you a map as to exactly where that is. But first, this is one of the better known places in the Salmon Clearwater Divide, I guess, in these pictures. This is the Gospel Hump Wilderness. Probably not one of the most well-known wildernesses in Idaho, but it's one of our amazing wilderness areas that we have that's protected from logging and roads and things like that. The Salmon Clearwater Divide has a pretty big variety of habitats. And so these pictures I took the one time that I've been to the divide, which was in the fall of 2018. I crossed the Wind River Pack Bridge, which starts, I think, around 2,000 feet in elevation on the Salmon River. You cross from the road on this bridge into the wilderness. It's just a footbridge, and you can climb away. In the bottom middle picture there, you'll see the Salmon River flowing down there way far below where I went on my excursion into the Gospel Hump. But anyway, it's a really beautiful place. You'll see that this area did have a fire in recent years, and it was lovely. I highly recommend checking it out if you get the chance. Next slide. Okay, so the Salmon Clearwater Divide. We made it up. And on Monday, I made this map. You'll see there on the right in purple highlighting what we are calling the Salmon Clearwater Divide. The southern sort of bottom area there, that's the Salmon River, where it flows from east to west across Idaho. On the left edge of the Salmon Clearwater Divide is where the Salmon River curves north. On the top sort of north side of the Salmon Clearwater Divide, that's the South Fork of the Clearwater River. So this is the high sort of forested series of mountains that runs between the Salmon and the Clearwater River drainages. Next slide. So you've already heard about a lot of species in general in the Clearwater, and I'm going to show some pictures and talk specifically about a few and kind of species that are important in the cases that we're bringing because we care about them and because they give us important legal hooks for our case. So who lives on the Salmon Clearwater Divide? One thing I don't like about these Zoom panel presentations is that the audience can't really interact. But if anyone knows, even though I can't hear you, raise your hand, shout it out, say, yes, I know what that is. Maybe you're listening to this by yourself. Maybe you're with a friend or loved one, but shout it out. Can you go back for a second, Ellen?
Sorry.
Shout it out if you know what this creature is. And I'm sure about 90% of you got it right. This is a fisher, right? You guys had that? So fisher, it's a mammal. It's found throughout, well, you can see its range over there a lot in Canada and then in the Northern Rockies, particularly in Clearwater country. And the fisher is one of a number of species that rely primarily on mature and old growth forests and the complex sort of ecosystems that they set up. As you'll see in this picture, the fisher is not sitting in a giant open clearing that's been recently logged. It's sitting in a dense forest where it's able to hide under trees that may have died and fallen down for natural reasons, but it relies on that kind of complex landscape. And that's something that's lost when a forest is logged. Interesting fact about the fisher, because I actually didn't really know much about it. It's one of the few species that can successfully prey on porcupine, which I thought was pretty interesting. I've seen dogs try to prey on porcupine and that doesn't work very well, but apparently fisher can do it. Next slide. Okay, this has already been mentioned. This is probably a pretty easy one, but I think I heard some people say it, grizzly bear. The grizzly bear, there were once an estimated 50,000 grizzly bears in the lower 48 states. By the 1930s, they'd been reduced to about 2% of the range that they lived in. And to this day, as their populations have recovered, they've mostly been confined, as you'll see on the map to the right here, to the greater Yellowstone region. So in Yellowstone and surrounding Yellowstone National Park, and then the Northern Continental Divide region up near Glacier National Park, and then mostly in Montana. As Laird mentioned before, the Bitterroot ecosystem, because it's made up of protected wilderness areas and has few humans around, has been identified as an important place for grizzly recovery. The Salmon Clearwater Divide, where our logging projects that we're challenging are taking place, they are just adjacent to that Bitterroot area. And Madeline, where you see the little pointy part of that Bitterroot ecosystem, just above that and to the left, there's some blue. That's an area that the Fish and Wildlife Service has recently, for the first time, said is an area where grizzly bears may be present. For many years, there's been suspicions that there might be grizzlies in the Bitterroot ecosystem and surrounding areas. And just recently, in the last few years, there have been confirmed sightings of grizzly in and around that area, including on the Salmon Clearwater Divide. And even at the End of the World Project site in 2019, there was a verified sighting of a grizzly bear. Just the next spring in 2020, grizzly tracks were found that may have been the same bear staying over the winter. It could have been a different bear. And so again, just recently, it's been acknowledged that grizzly bears are and should be expected to be back in the Salmon Clearwater Divide and other parts of the greater Bitterroot ecosystem. Next slide. Who else lives on the salmon Clearwater Divide? I'm guessing most of you are at least able to say fish. This is a particular kind of fish. This is a steelhead. And steelhead salmon, one of the great migrations of the world, come back to central Idaho, swimming hundreds of miles upstream to get back to the high country in central and north central Idaho. Not only do we have steelhead on the salmon Clearwater Divide, but there are salmon, west slope, cutthroat trout, bull trout, but steelhead in particular do spawn and rear in a number of the streams that are located up on the salmon Clearwater Divide and will be adversely impacted by logging. Next slide. And of course, who else lives on the salmon Clearwater Divide? Well, trees and old growth forests and forests. As has already been mentioned, forests and old growth and mature forests in particular are very important for wildlife. They're important ecosystems. They're resilient to fire. They help slow down climate change. And here's just a sampling of some of the trees in the Clearwater Divide. So starting on the left, if anyone wants to guess that, if you can figure out based on seeing the pine cone there, that's a Douglas fir. Next one over, I think is probably the only one I could have identified going into this. That's a ponderosa pine. Next one over, those are grand fir. And then finally on the right, Engelmann spruce. Those are just some of the trees that you can find on the salmon Clearwater Divide. Next slide. So getting back specifically to the end of the world and the Hungry Ridge projects, which you can see outlined in red there on our map. This is a map made by Paul Mitchell at Conservation Geography. Paul makes awesome maps and cool bumper stickers and all kinds of great stuff. You should check out his website. 3 things to know about Hungry Ridge and end of the world. They're massive amounts of logging. They're right next to each other and they're going to happen at the same time. So you heard some references earlier to logging projects that were in the tens of millions of board feet, maybe even one project from a long time ago that was over 100 million board feet. Well, both of these are each over 100 million board feet. And in fact, one is in the 140 million board feet range, the other 170. So together, these projects are so big, we're talking about 300 or so million board feet over the next 10 years. Right next to each other. And the amount of logging is about 26,000 acres. For those of you that know that you divide the number of acres by about 640 to get the square miles, it's about 40 square miles of logging between these 2 projects together. Next slide. This is just, I was playing around with Google Earth. I'm trying to perfect my skills. These are not precise, but I attempted to draw the 2 projects on there. So this is from the south, if you were up above the Salmon River, which you can see there in the foreground of the picture, looking north towards Grangeville. Those are the 2 projects, End of the World in yellow on the left, Hungry Ridge on the right. Next slide. And just a similar view from the north, that's Grangeville in the bottom portion of the screen, looking south with the Salmon River there in the far distance. Next slide. And so just to help, again, emphasize how big these projects are, this chart shows historical logging at the End of the World project site. So one of the 2 that's involved in our case. So you'll see that in the 1940s, there was an increase in logging up through the 80s, where it got up to a pretty good amount of logging. And then it kind of dropped off in the 90s for a few decades. And then just the End of the World project itself, which is scheduled for the next 10 years, dwarfs these other decades of logging. Next slide. Same thing at Hungry Ridge, building up through the 80s, falling off, and then Hungry Ridge, again, dwarfing all these other past decades of logging. Next slide. So, as was already mentioned by both Laird and Katie, the Forest Service likes to present these projects as sounding pretty good and hiding the fact that really most of what's going to happen is a lot of commercial logging. This is the environmental assessment prepared for the End of the World project. So the Forest Service released this document that purports to look at the various environmental effects of the project. We have to lay out the purpose and need, and I'm just going to read the bullet points on the right here. But they make it sound like a pretty good project. Reduce the risk or extent of, or increase resilience to insect or disease infestation. Reduce wildfire risks to the local communities and surrounding federal lands. Restore forest vegetation, dry meadows and grasslands to a healthy condition, and improve water quality and aquatic habitats. Next slide. So that sounds pretty nice, and I didn't really hear much of a mention of logging. This is a map of what's actually going to happen with the project. In orange, you'll see regen, that's essentially clear cuts. And then in yellow and sort of darker green, those are other logging. So you'll see that really most of the site's going to be logged. There's a little bit of prescribed burning, which does not involve logging. And these projects do include some watershed restoration, some road decommissioning, some culvert replacements. But really, they're just going to log the heck out of the areas. And just to give you a few stats specific to the End of the World project, it's 19,000 total acres of logging. Of those, 1,600 acres are clear cuts. That includes 12 supersized clear cuts that exceed the normal 40-acre limit on clear cuts. And then within old growth forest, the most important forests at the site, that's 364 acres of logging, including 5 acres that will be clear cut. Next slide. Hungry Ridge, it's basically the same story. I won't read through these bullet points, but pretty similar things. They make it sound like they're going to help restore the forest, they're going to improve watershed conditions, and there's very little, if any, mention of logging. Next slide. And again, for Hungry Ridge, it really is a lot of logging. This shows in yellow the some of the logging called intermediate harvest, and then in green, the regeneration harvest, which is the clear cuts. Hungry Ridge is mostly all clear cuts. And again, stats on Hungry Ridge. A total of over 7,000 acres of logging. Most of those are clear cuts. That's 5,185 acres. Here at Hungry Ridge, there's going to be 29 of these supersized clear cuts that exceed the normal 40-acre limit, including one that's more than 10 times that, a 405-acre clear cut. And in old growth, over 600 acres are going to be logged, including 530 acres of old growth that will be clear cut. And we're on to Rebecca.
Awesome. And so Rebecca, you should be able to share your screen.
Yes, I am sharing my screen. So as people have said, we filed the complaint today, just this afternoon, in fact. And so I'm actually, first, my name is Rebecca Strauss. I'm a legal fellow at Advocates for the West. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the complaint and sort of summarize and combine everything that Laird, Brian, and Katie have said and distill it down into what we're actually fighting. So what are we challenging? As Brian just said, we're challenging these two massive logging projects. And under what statute? So the first statute is the National Environmental Policy Act, which is sort of the Magna Carta of the environmental law world. And so one of the things that is required under the National Environmental Policy Act is that the agency use best available science. So what does that mean? It sort of means that they can't promulgate all of the myths that Katie was talking about earlier. So for instance, fireproofing actions taken on private property are the biggest factor driving whether and to what degree private property will survive a wildfire. It doesn't have to do with the fuel load or the density of the trees. It's really the property specific. in terms of other wildfire, this wildfire and intensity ignition, it's strongly related to weather conditions and only weakly related to fuel loads, especially in subalpine forest. So when you have the Forest Service writing about their purpose and need and reducing wildfire and trying to save nearby property, that sounds great, but it doesn't mirror or take into account the best available science, which is required under NEPA. Another thing is old growth can actually protect from the high severity wildfires. This is actually a redwood, but it sort of gives this sense that old growth doesn't burn as quickly or as easily as wildfire or as smaller, younger trees. And so if you just cut down all the old growth ostensibly to protect from fire, you're actually making the forest more susceptible to fire. And we have the Biden administration is coming out and is very concerned about climate change and actually converting old growth and mature forests to younger forest by logging reduces that stored carbon and increases atmospheric carbon dioxides for decades. And so again, current forest management is projected to reduce the rate of carbon dioxide sequestration in forests, as opposed to allowing those forests to mature, which could remove more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than logging in the long run. And that sort of ties back to what Katie was saying earlier as well. And another thing that the agency must do under the National Environmental Policy Act is take a hard look. And so again, we'll look at grizzly bears and failing to take a hard look at the direct, indirect, and cumulative effects of logging and associated activities on wildlife habitat, including for the grizzly bear, which is listed under the Endangered Species Act, as well as for fisher, marten, wolverine, and other sensitive species. And so I won't harp on this too much because everybody has been talking about grizzly bears, but they're now back in this area. And the Forest Service sort of said, we don't really need to consider them. And also fish. We can play Brian's game. You might be able to guess what this one is. This is the steelhead trout. And they are named as high risk in this area, but there are other interesting fish species. Anybody know, can anybody differentiate between various fish species? I hear, yes, bull trout. And then also the Chinook salmon. And again, the Forest Service has failed to take a hard look. There's the bull trout, sorry about that. And there's the Chinook salmon. And so by logging and reducing water quality and fish habitat conditions, the Forest Service has downplayed and dismissed the risk of sediment from logging. Now, and we are also challenging this action under the National Forest Management Act. Under this act, every national forest requires a forest plan, which for the Nez Perce Forest, it was adopted in 1987, and it just describes how to manage and protect the forest as well as the wildlife who live there. And especially it talks about old growth standards. And so the way the Forest Service looked at old growth ended up being some funny math to claim that there was enough old growth. They counted they have this area that needs to be managed as an old growth, but they didn't actually determine how much old growth was actually in those areas. And when they were counting up all of the old growth to determine whether or not they had maintained that 10% threshold as required by the forest plan, they said, oh yeah, all of the, it's 100% old growth in those areas, even though it probably isn't, and they didn't check. So that's, again, is a failure to take a hard look, which is a requirement under NEPA, and a violation of that 10% standard as required by the National Forest Management Act. So what are we asking from the court? If we could get everything, what would we get? So obviously we want to vacate the end of the world approval. And if not that, at least make them do an environmental impact statement. As Brian mentioned, the National Environmental Policy Act, it requires federal agencies to prepare an environmental impact statement, which is a deeper analysis for all major federal actions significantly affecting the quality of the human environment. And even though this is a massive logging project, the forest still said that the effects of this project were not significant, even though there's over 100 million board feet of logging. And then for Hungry Ridge, obviously we want to get rid of that approval. And if not, at least make them, they did an environmental impact statement for Hungry Ridge, but as I've sort of discussed, they didn't do a good job at considering the best available science or taking a hard look. While the Forest Service sings along, we are singing a different tune. Advocates for the West has been fighting to protect biodiversity of the Clearwater since our early days. We have won victories to halt other misguided logging projects. We thwarted dirty oil scheme to turn Highway 12 into a high and wide industrial corridor for megaloads of machinery headed to tar sands. We have a case underway now for the Idaho Conservation League to stop rampant and unregulated suction dredge mining on the South Clearwater River. And our fight to protect the Clearwater continues. When we stop End of the World and Hungry Ridge, we'll feel fine. And Madeline?
I'm glad you got that audio in there, Rebecca, since I messed up Brian's attempt. Sorry about that. Awesome, thank you. And it looks like we have, I know we're at an hour mark, but I know we did get a few questions, so maybe we can at least answer what we have. And if folks need to drop off, we understand. But let me just start with the two we've got going. And so I don't know if who this would be, but Chris asked, how many miles of roads would have to be constructed to support these projects? Do we know that?
I think I have a partial answer. So for Hungry Ridge, there's about 9 miles of new permanent road that would be built. There's about 23 miles of temporary road that may or may not actually be temporary that would be built. And about 70 more miles of road would be reconditioned or reconstructed and maintained in ways that also has impacts. I don't have the stats for End of the World before me, but it's probably something similar.
The End of the World has what they call a fuel break. That's going to be about 16 miles. It's on a road, so I'm guessing it's basically like road reconstruction. It has 15 miles of temporary roads, and surprisingly not as much as Hungry Ridge. So that's...
Thank you both. And then Louise asked, is the Forest Service doing either of these sales under the Farm Bill Authority? Anybody know?
I think that's a Katie question, yeah.
Oh gosh. Hungry Ridge is definitely not under the Farm Bill Authority. I believe no. I think it's under the I think End of the World is under the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, but that is not the Farm Bill Authority is kind of categorical exclusions or special projects under that, and this doesn't fall under not that. So.
And then we've got from Brett, is there an ESA claim for either project?
Yes, for grizzly bears, we do have ESA claims that they failed to consult. So when they looked at grizzly bears and the Forest Service said, you know, maybe some grizzlies have been in the area recently, but we don't actually want to consider that. They did that both in their NEPA document, the environmental assessment for End of the World, and the EIS for Hungry Ridge. They just said, yeah, we're not even going to look at what the impacts would be to grizzly. But they also refused to do Endangered Species Act consultation with Fish and Wildlife Service, which is a really important part of the Endangered Species Act that makes sure when federal agencies take actions, they're not going to jeopardize the continued existence of endangered species. So that is one of the things that we're raising and we'll be addressing in the case.
Good question. And Melody, I have the same question, so this is not naive. What is the advantage to the Forest Service of authorizing these logging proposals? What do they get out of it?
They get a lot of money. So they're selling the logging rights to timber companies. And so this is very important. And the way that the Forest Service in part is funded is by selling these logging rights. And that's sort of how they tie everything together. And so they say, oh, we need to do the logging so that we have the money to sort of do the road, getting rid of the roads and cleaning up the culverts and doing the prescribed burns and doing all of this habitat restoration that's needed. And then, oh, but we're just doing a little bit of logging to help like support the great habitat work that we're doing. And there is science that suggests that some forest management is beneficial to habitat, but there's a difference between strategically cutting down few smaller trees to help the old growth as opposed to just clear cutting supersize areas of old growth because old growth also tends to be the most lucrative timber.
And to piggyback onto Rebecca, I think so the Forest Service has had like the culture embedded in the agency is kind of a get out the cut kind of culture. And I think there's a really great book out there. It's from a while ago now. It's by Paul Hurt. It's called The Conspiracy of Optimism. It kind of talks about how the logging industry kind of made its way into the mentality of the Forest Service. And culturally, it's still very much there.
Interesting. Thanks, Katie. And that was The Conspiracy of Optimism?
The Conspiracy of Optimism, yeah. By Paul Hurt, I think is the author.
Wonderful. Well, it looks like that might be all of our questions. So I will finish us out and just do a big thank you to all of our panelists. Laird had a tech issue, so he extends his thanks to everyone for being here, and he had to leave a little early. And of course, thank you so much to Katie and your team at Friends of the Clearwater for the work you're doing and also for all your help tonight. We really appreciate it. And I also just want to remind everyone that we do host these social distancing hours the last Wednesday of every month. So keep your eyes peeled for an announcement for what our May topic will be. And I also just want to plug that tomorrow is the first day of Idaho Gives, which is going to be a week of statewide giving for nonprofits across the state. And so we would love your support. We have an amazing matching opportunity through the SONA Fund for $40,000 that we're hoping to raise. And it's also just a really great week for all the amazing nonprofits, Friends of the Clearwater, so many other partners that we have in this work. So please check it out. It's idahogives.org tomorrow through May 6th. And thank you all and appreciate each of you being here. And I hope you all have a lovely Wednesday night. This will be posted on our YouTube channel, so you can check it out there. All right. Thank you, everyone.